Hello, Jeff Zwerink here again with Give and Take, where we look at the latest scientific ideas and how they help you be more confident to go out and share the gospel. And today we have a very special guest. I'm excited about our show, Eddy Del Rio, and we're going to look at the importance of the crucifixion and what medically went on during that. Eddy, it's good to have you here today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here.
So I'm excited about this. I know you've got a medical degree from St. Louis University.
That's right.
You're a family practice physician. And I just am excited about the chance to explore medically what's going on during the crucifixion. Because a lot of times we see a pretty sanitized version of it. And this is a pretty brutal thing, but one thing I find interesting is that it looks like the Gospels are pretty accurate about what's going on.
Very much so.
So as a physician, what stands out to you as you read the Gospel accounts of the crucifixion?
One thing I'd say right off the bat is one of the Gospels was written by a physician. And that's interesting to begin with.
That is an interesting
The Gospel
point.
of Luke.
Right.
I think that the suffering that Jesus underwent actually can begin with a stop mark at the Last Supper. At the Last Supper, he's having his last opportunity to hydrate himself. And from there on forward, he's not going to have another chance to either hydrate or get rest or sleep.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of happens in the evening. So we're talking about, having a full day as well as going into this largely happening in the night and through the next day, correct?
That's absolutely right. He moves from the Last Supper to that time in the Garden of Gethsemane when he is wanting his inner circle to be supportive, but eventually by the end of that time suffers the psychological trauma of being betrayed and abandoned. And that would certainly work on him too.
Well, and this is where, he's of such anguish in there that he's sweating like blood as well.
That's right. And though some people say he may have sweat blood, I think Scripture uses the word as in order to indicate the simile. That is, he was sweating so profusely that it appears as if someone were actually bleeding.
So this would bear into the dehydration that we're talking about. Whether it's blood or whether it's sweat, we're losing a lot of fluids here, one way or the other.
Precisely. He's going to begin dehydrating himself over the next many hours. And I think that's going to contribute to his ultimate demise. Yeah.
So he goes, he's got the Garden of Gethsemane. Not only is he just sweating, a lot of fluid loss, the difficulty of betrayal. Now he's facing trials. What goes on in the trials that stands out to you?
Well, he's led from Gethsemane to first a pretrial with Annas, who had been the former high priest for 16 years and sort of served as a dynastic leader in that economy. And his son-in-law, Caiaphas, is the current high priest. What I find interesting medically in his trial before Caiaphas is that they blindfold Jesus and strike him.
So, I look at that and see there's a humiliation, it's like, hey, nanny, nanny, boo-boo type thing. Again, there's something more medically significant about that.
There is. They do tease him, they strike him, and they ask him, prophesy, tell us who struck you. But from a medical perspective, we have reflexes that help protect us when we're about to suffer injury. The body tenses, the muscles contract and form a sort of armor, so to speak, that helps limit internal injury, even injury to the muscles themselves. When Christ is blindfolded and being struck, he doesn't know from what direction, what body part, at what time, and so he's unable to do these protective reflexes. That means that he suffers greater degree from these blows than you or I would have if we were able to witness those striking us.
That's interesting. It just kind of amplifies the amount of abuse he's taken, or helps us realize more the amount of abuse he's taken. So we go on from the trials. He walks around quite a bit. Ultimately, he ends up being flogged. Again, what's going on in the flogging, and how does that play into ultimately how Jesus is going to die?
Of course, Pilate has determined that he's going to go with the crowd. He releases Barabbas and condemns Jesus to be killed by crucifixion, despite even claiming that he found nothing guilty in him. The detail of the Roman soldiers begin by flogging Jesus. Though Jews had rules about limiting how many times someone could be struck, not so the Roman detail. It would be in their interest to bring the convicted to an inch of their death so that their job happens faster than normal. And so Jesus would have been injured severely by his flesh wounds. It's not often known that the integument, that is the skin, is the largest organ in the body. And so what we're saying is his largest organ was receiving tremendous injury. This is going to also hasten the fluid loss and injury that he suffers.
So he's flogged and then ultimately given his cross, and the hike up to Golgotha, hike I put in quotes there. I know you have more to say about that.
Well, first let's begin with this member that's put on his back. This piece of timber probably weighed about 100 pounds.
That's not a light piece of wood.
It's not. Not for me to carry, not for you to carry 0.6 of a mile. That would be the distance from the Praetorium to Golgotha, where he's going to be finally executed.
And that's not nice level ground either. We're going ups and downs.
Ups and downs, and here his back has been flayed, and this is put on him. 100 pounds is like, in more common terms, 11.5 gallons of milk strapped on somebody. That's a big load. And obviously the scripture records that he wasn't able to do this. He collapses. The Roman detail picks someone out of the crowd right there and says, it turns out to be Simon, to carry the cross for Jesus.
So let's go to the last thing to discuss that I want to discuss today. The blood and the water flowed when Jesus was on the cross. They pierced him with the spear. What's going on there? How does that help us see the validity of the scriptures?
This can be directly explained by a phenomenon called pericardial effusion.
Okay.
The heart is maintained inside a sac that is fibrous and not elastic.
Not very expandable.
It's not expandable at all. A tiny little bit of fluid there makes sure that the movements of the heart pumping are frictionless. But that fluid itself and that potential space can actually become filled with fluid. We call this a pericardial effusion. If this is severe enough, it begins to squeeze the heart down in a condition we call tamponade. Now,
so this is basically just squeezing Jesus' heart to where it quits being able to function.
It's important for the heart to have full relaxation, of full expansion in order to refill, to move the circulation. If it's only able to fill a little bit where the circulation is failing right there. But with sufficient pressure on the heart, this phenomenon called tamponade, even the valves in the heart can now be misaligned and further circulatory problems entail. I believe Jesus has suffered tremendous cardiovascular collapse. Ultimately, of course, he dies. The detail has means to hasten or test whether the convictees are dead. And Scripture indicates that a spear was thrust into Jesus, very likely underneath the middle of his sternum, piercing this sac, releasing clear fluid.
So the blood and the water flowing out here.
And blood maintained inside the heart. Some of that would have filled in, and so it's explained that way.
You know, I really do find this fascinating, that as we look at the accounts given in Scripture of how Jesus died, what he suffered, the events that happened, they really do line up. They make medical sense. You know, I would encourage you to check out a video we have. It's a little older resource, but it talks a lot about this, called Behold the Man, that it helps us understand just the amount of suffering that Jesus went through and how reliable the Gospels are, and that we can be confident going out and sharing that the Gospels tell us what's true and be just confident of how much Jesus loved us.